Right now, back to issues at hand. A new survey conducted by the Afrobarometer has found that many respondents actually believe that corruption has worsened under President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration. In a total of 1,600 people who took part in the survey conducted between May and June this year, a total of 64% of the people interviewed said that 2020 has been a bad year. Now, according to the survey, among those believed to be the corrupt are officials in the presidency, police and local government councillors. The presidency registers the largest increase in perceived corruption between 2019 and 2021, rising from 38% to 53%. And the survey also found that 70% of the participants believe that the government has failed to act on corruption. Political commentator Oliver Dickson joins us now to share his perspective on all of this. Oliver, good morning. Welcome to Morning Live.
Morning, Sakina. Thanks for having me once again.
So what do you attribute this perception to?
You know, last night I had a conversation with Jainisha Patel, one of the researchers on the survey. And I asked her, did you guys, account for political biases, political affiliation, and media reportage at the time? And so that's to say, how many of the 1,600 respondents that you interviewed do you know to be DA supporters or ANC supporters? Because if I take a random sample of 1,600 people who coincidentally all vote ANC, right, you'll have a different outcome as opposed to 1,600 sample size of people who all vote DA, right? And so that's the first thing we must take into consideration about the modality of the survey. And the second thing is, if you're going to ask people this question around the times William Kiza is making headline in the Daily Maverick every other day, the perception is going to change if you rewind maybe 6 months earlier, and that story is not making headlines. Or, for instance, the story around the firing of Bandile Masuku is making headlines. The story around Kusela Diko being involved in corruption, being an employee within the presidency is making headlines. So all of those things matter, right? But nonetheless, perception matters, and what this is effectively a perception report, despite most of the headlines across the media spectrum yesterday saying corruption worsened under Ramaphosa, but without indicating that this is the perception of corruption having worsened, right? But importantly, perception matters because it ultimately says how much faith and trust people have in the institutions that they're engaging with. One of the indices in this barometer that fascinated me was how many people who were actually comfortable saying that I've had to pay a bribe, for instance, to get a police officer to be lenient towards me or to treat me fairly or to treat me correctly. I've had to pay a bribe to get medical service. I've had to pay a bribe to get my child into a certain private school. I've had to pay a bribe to get a documented home affairs. And you can look at those numbers in those barometers. It's shocking how many people often have to do that. And again, that relates to the trust that people have in these institutions. That trust completely eroded. But the indice that makes the most a shocking revelation to me. It's just that how many people think the increase in corruption in the police service has become more prevalent. I think that number is above 60%, I think, closer to the 70% mark. And that for me is telling just about the deterioration in our public service more than it is about the erosion of trust in politicians. I think that's always been prevalent, but I think now people have finally lost trust in the public service. Remember, public service are not politicians. Public service are you and I, oftentimes, ordinary people who form part of our community.
But it's a long-standing perception, that one. But as you say, very concerning that the numbers are as high as they are, even though it is, of course, a perception matter. But as you say, not only do perceptions matter, they are all powerful, especially in the political arena. Now, the survey also found that South Africans say that corruption is even in the office of the president. Did the presidency's handling of the Kusela Diko matter for example, make things worse for this perception of the presidency and the president?
Oh, no, it certainly has. If you would recall at the time where the survey ended its inquiry, which would have been June of this year, Kusela Diko was still under suspension. The headlines around her husband, her belated husband, were also still in the headlines quite a lot. And the presidency was acting very indecisively towards this. In fact, President Ramaphosa has been acting indecisively altogether. You see, the thing about perception is that a good communication strategy can undo perception, right? You just have to act like you're doing something, and then people will think you're doing something. You don't actually have to do something, and I feel sad for saying that, but a good communication strategy can undo this, and the president has not even gotten that correct, because had he gotten that correct, right, the picture would have been different. Had the president actually engaged the media a lot more, give us more detailed status reports, because I do think some things have happened. I think our SIU is in better health, our asset forfeiture unit is in better health. I think the Hawks are in better health. I'm not convinced about the NPA being in better health today than, say, under Sean Abrams a few years ago. But I do think some of these corruption-busting institutions are a lot more active today than they were, say, 4 years ago. That might be attributed to the fact that PPE corruption happened, and had that not happened, it wouldn't have been the case. That might be the case that, think about the fact that the Hawks, the SIU, and the asset forfeiture unit working in unison crack down the VBS saga, right? A lot of those people involved in VBS are arrested today and are facing prosecution. So we can't ignore the fact that these things happen. But I think there's very little reportage around it that speaks to the detail of it, because the presidency has no idea how to communicate and engage with the media in a way that respects you and I as media professionals. I mean, he comes and gives a speech and walks away and takes no questions, right? There may have been a different perception altogether had he allowed for such a conversation to take place.
But it looks as though, despite all of what you've just mentioned, despite repeated talk to ramp up on anti-corruption efforts, the public still feels failed. They still feel let down.
Especially because the PPE corruption scandal, I think, Sakina, happened under the most dire time, perhaps in human history, not just in South Africa, but globally over the last 100 years. The fact that people are dying by the thousands every day from a pandemic, and you have the audacity to steal from them, that gives an indication that corruption is in free fall within the state, in free fall within the ANC-run government, and in free fall within the ANC. And no matter how much corruption-busting talk you give while that's happening, it will certainly undo any sort of progress you would have made.
Also of great concern, Oliver, is the survey mentions that people fear retaliation if they report corruption to the authorities. Now, that's very concerning. If you look at the risk faced by whistleblowers, this has been an issue for a long time, and once again highlighted by the killing of Babita Deokaran. Let's talk about that, because if people feel that way, then it's obvious that they will not come forward to basically speak out against any sort of corruption or malfeasance.
I mean, before this, the survey would have been done before the passing, unfortunately, the brutal killing of Babita. But the story that came to mind for me prior to that, for instance, is just the fact that Susan Daniels blew the whistle on corruption at Eskom, and she had to relocate entirely and go live in Washington, D.C. For the sake of her family and for her own safety. And that's at more the higher scale of corruption, right? But I don't feel comfortable, Sakina, reporting police officers participating in malfeasance, because I certainly know that I'll face some sort of retaliation that might call into question my own safety. I mean, if police officers are willing to cooperate with brutal drug dealers, what will my life that has no meaning to them mean? And so that is deeply worrying, and that because the only way we can fix corruption in the public service in particular is if citizens feel comfortable to come forward to report corruption. You remember a couple of years ago, around 2014, I think, President Jacob Zuma had launched the direct toll-free line into the presidency, where you could call and report corruption or call and complain just about anything. They had to shut that line down because it was inactive. That's to say, people just weren't using it, weren't coming forward and reporting any sort of corruption within the public service. And so Minister Thulas Nxesi has to ask himself a couple of hard questions. How do I work with the public to fix the perception in the public service, and how do I collaborate with Minister Ayanda Tlotlo to make sure that the public comes forward and reports on these sorts of things to us in ways that we protect the public, in ways that we hide the identity of the public, and in ways that we can guarantee the public we will act on it. Because if I have no guarantee you will act on it, I won't even come forward to begin with. So how do they create an ecosystem where we have those sorts of guarantees that will encourage people to come forward? I think only then will we start having public servants who are participating, encouraging and fostering a culture of corruption. Only then will we have those dealt with.
A minute left, Oliver. What should leadership take from this? Does it mean people are more interested in action than in creating institutions without action?
The leadership should take from this the idea that people, regardless of how much work they're doing or they think that they're doing, people are not trusting them. And leading without trust from the citizenry means you're leading with an illegitimate mandate. And that should be worrying to anyone who is in any form of leadership within the government right now. But I must add, Sakina, this report also deals with, corruption perception in among traditional leaders who are not necessarily in the state, and also deals with corruption perception in the private sector, which isn't as prevalent as corruption perception in government, but is also on the rise. All in that report, and I think the entire country should be worried. So congratulations to Marcus Jooste and Steinhoff for eroding any sort of faith that the public may have had in the private sector. KPMG and McKinsey played a big role in that too, I would assume, given their participation in corruption. And so I think everybody should look deeply within their souls and the DNA of their institutions and ask the question, how do we win back the trust of the public? Which is a very hard question to answer.
Well, thanks so much for your time. We'll leave it there. Political commentator Oliver Dickson commenting on the findings of a survey that was conducted by Afrobarometer, which has found that many of those who participated believe that corruption was worsened under the current administration. So